You'd think nobles, with all their coin and cellars, kept food the longest. Dead wrong. It was the peasants, the folks with smoke-black rafters, dirt under their nails, and more grit than silver, who learned to make a Sunday roast last until next Christmas and sometimes the one after. And they did it with something you probably have sitting on a shelf in your kitchen right now. Salt. Not just a sprinkle, not just a finish. In the Middle Ages, salt was survival, crystalline gold, the difference between a full table in February and a hungry quiet. Here's what most people miss. Salt isn't just flavor, it is a moisture vampire. It drags water out of meat, the way a summer sun pulls steam off a pond. And the little culprits that spoil your food. They hate dry more than cats hate bath time. So peasants didn't play nice. They packed slabs in salt, then packed more, then waited. Think your blood pressure warning label looks intense. This stuff could have cured leather boots, but it worked. 1 pig, handled right, salted hard. Stored cool, could feed a family of 6 through to winters. 2. Imagine shopping once, and not returning to a market for 24 months. Try explaining that to the grocer, who lives off your weekly visits. Of course, there was a price. Not just coin though. In many places, a pound of salt cost a day's wages, like dropping $60 on table salt. No, I mean taste. This meat was the Dead Sea on a plate. If you didn't know what you were doing, you had to soak it. Hours, sometimes overnight. Water in, salt out, again and again. I watched my grandmother do it with old country ham, changing the water 3 times like a ritual you dared not rush. Patience taught by brine. Here's the bigger picture. Salt merchants had power. No salt, no preserved meat, no preserved meat, no cushion when winter bit hard. Trade routes formed around this white rock. Towns built economies on preserved pork. Families guarded techniques like heirlooms. The ones who mastered it didn't just survive. They leveraged it. When neighbors ran short, they knocked. You don't barter a recipe. You barter a hunk of safety wrapped in cloth and salt. But salt was only step 1. The real alchemy came with smoke, not the hang it above a campfire and hope kind. I'm talking dedicated smokehouses, stone and timber chambers tuned like instruments. These people knew their woods. Oak for depth, apple for sweetness, hickory when you meant business, cherry when you wanted color that glowed like dusk on the rind. Smoke is chemistry in a cloak. Phenols lay down a thin shield, a whispered-in armor on the surface, while slow, low heat eases out what water remains. Less moisture, fewer bacteria, more flavor. And don't kid yourself. Temperature control wasn't a 20th century invention. They managed draw and exhaust with stones and shutters, shifted embers to create hot and cool zones, and held steady for days. No dials, no thermometers. Just skill passed hand to hand, fire to fire. There was a catch. Smoke demanded attention. Someone had to tend it like a needy but very useful pet. But that workload bred community. Smoking week turned into a block party with aprons. Meat hung shoulder to shoulder yours, next to the neighbor's, and you learned fast that shared labor meant shared survival. Done right, you had meat that lasted 6 months or more without ice, without anything but wood and time. Better yet, it tasted like something you'd detour a road for. People did. Some villages earned reputations worth an extra day's travel. No stars on the door, just the promise that you'd make it through February with something worth chewing. Then winter itself stepped in like a silent partner. Everyone talks salt and smoke, but the real game changer sometimes fell from the sky. Cold, ice, snow. These folks figured out what your freezer does. Without a plug, cold slows rot to a crawl. But they weren't tossing meat into a snowbank and calling it good. They dug deep 10 feet lined pits with stone and straw, then layered meat in barrels or clay jars with ice and snow. Frozen lasagna, 1 stratum at a time. In places with the right climate, they got downright ambitious. They harvested blocks from ponds and rivers at the hard edge of winter, stored them in insulated sheds padded with sawdust, and rationed that cold all the way into spring. Simple idea, brutal work, powerful results. Different lands had different tricks. Mountain folk leaned on caves that kept their own chill. Coastal villages used sea ice that held longer than the puddle stuff. Some communities pooled resources and built communal ice houses, an ancient version of a neighborhood coop. It wasn't perfect. You needed weather on your side and regular upkeep, or you'd wake up to disaster in a barrel. But where ice was steady, you saw fewer hungry seasons and fewer families knocked down by spoiled stores. Planning well meant the difference between getting by and getting ahead. Still, the most elegant solution might have been the simplest. Acid vinegar. Medieval cooks learned that if you dunk meat in a tart bath, spoilage surrenders. Acidity makes life miserable for bacteria. Think of it as locking the door and throwing the key into a barrel of pickles. And they didn't just splash and hope. They built brines, vinegar, and salt in tandem to walls. One gate, chunks of meat went into clay crocks, submerged under a bite that didn't stay on the surface. It seeped down the fibers, pushed into the muscle, and turned the whole cut into hostile territory for decay. Now, was it delicious? Not at first bite. It had an argument with the pickle jar and the jar won, but you could cook with that thanks to it. Temper tanned. Suddenly you had brightness in a season that offered nothing but brown and gray. Whole villages planned pickling days. Imagine half a town around steaming vats, clay and wood and wool everywhere, gossip and laughter riding on the sour air. Regions developed signatures. Some threw in herbs, some spices they could afford. A few leaned on fruit vinegars. These weren't one-off tricks. They became the backbone of local kitchens for centuries. Even the high tables served tangy preserved cuts, next to the fresh contrast as a luxury. And when the technique worked across a household, meat stretched not just one winter, but 2 full turns of the snow without losing a scrap to rot. That wasn't just clever. That was the difference between we made it and we didn't. But you never bet the barn on one method. Herbs and spices joined the arsenal. Rosemary, thyme, sage, cloves, little leaves with big chemistry. They didn't know the names rosmarinic acid, thymol, eugenol, but they knew results. They crushed and rubbed, sometimes mixing herbs with coarse salt to make what we'd call a rub. Then wrapped meat in cloth or tucked it into clay. Some families guarded blends like treasure. Your great-great-grandmother's mix wasn't a garnish. It was a safety net. The downside, you had to grow, dry, and store them. One bad season could empty a rack. That's why no one relied on a single rope when crossing a ravine. You layered. Monasteries wrote a lot of this down because monks wrote everything down. Their notes read like the lab books of robed food scientists. Lamb likes rosemary and thyme. Pork shines with sage and juniper. So peasants did what works. Salt first, herb second. Maybe a kiss of smoke after belt and suspenders. Redundancy that kept your dinner where it belonged, on the hook, not in the compost. Preservation days turned into exchanges. You lend thyme, I share sage. We all leave with something better than we brought. Nothing knits a village like the shared memory of past hunger and the determination never to repeat it. Then came one of the smartest moves of all. Sealing meat in fat, rendered lard or beef suet, poured hot over cut pieces tucked into ceramic crocks or wooden barrels. When that fat cooled, it set. The air couldn't get in, and without air, all those little spoilage parties never start. Simple physics, simple triumph. Better yet, it traveled. Salt barrels are heavy, smokehouses are fixed. Ice is fickle, but a crock sealed in fat can ride a wagon. Merchants carried it to markets. Soldiers marched with it. Families moving to new fields took their pantry along. Portable preservation. Medieval lunchbox. No spoilage. Yes, it demanded resources. Poor families had to choose. Use lard for cooking all winter, or gamble it to preserve meat. And it could be messy. Scraping fat later meant warm water and stubbornness. But nothing went to waste. You melted the seal again for the next batch. Sometimes you steeped the fat with rosemary, thyme, garlic flavor, married to function. If you're thinking you've heard of this, you have. Later cooks would call it confit, and serve it for a price the old peasants would have found hilarious. They didn't invent it in a restaurant. They invented it because snow falls and hunger is patient, and in the overlap of all these methods, a quiet miracle happened. Dry aging, discovered by necessity. No one called it that. They called it hanging the meat until it stopped bleeding on the floor. You found a place with the right conditions: cool, dry, a good breeze, maybe a corner of the barn. Maybe that blessed cellar, not so cold it froze, not so warm it went to fuzz. Hang it, watch it, wait. Inside, enzymes did their slow, invisible work, softening tough fibers. Outside, moisture left in a whisper, concentrating the flavor. The surface dried into a protective rind, a natural shell you'd trim off later and toss into stew to make magic in a pot. This wasn't just preservation, it was an accident of gourmet. That deep, nutty complexity high-end steakhouses boast about today. The peasants stumbled into it because they had no choice, and a decent draft. It wasn't foolproof. Get cavalier with humidity and you'd grow a science fair. Try it during a warm spell and you'd regret it. That's why late fall slaughter mattered. Steady cold, slow aging. Weeks or months to transform a stubborn old cow into tenderness even a tooth-poor grandfather could manage. The hardest part, not giving in too soon while your belly grumbled and the wind said maybe just a slice. But patience paid, and even the trimmings, the hard, Dark shell went into soups and stews, turning bleak broth into something that tasted like sunshine. Remembered. Put it all together, and you see the system. Salt as bedrock, smoke as craft, winter as ally, vinegar as shield, herbs as quiet chemistry, fat as a lock, air and time as a sculptor. It wasn't one secret. It was a toolkit built from observation, muscle, and memory. Nobles could afford fresh kills and banquets that wilted in a day. Peasants needed insurance policies you could see, touch, and chew. So they wrote them into barrels, hung them on hooks, buried them in pits, layered them in crocks, and seasoned them with stories. A family that knew its brines and smokes, its cold pits and crocks, its herbs and rinds well. That family walked into January with its head high. And you, worrying about a 3-day sell-by date. Somewhere, a woman in a wool apron smiles from across 7 centuries. She salted hard because the snow was coming. She kept the fire low and steady because babies were sleeping and the smoke had to curl just right. She trekked to the pond for ice because she had plans for April. She tied threads of rosemary and counted cloves like coins. She poured lard that gleamed like cream and waited for the set. She hung meat in the place where the breeze sang. She trimmed the bark and dropped it into pot and watched the broth go dark and rich. She didn't have a fridge. She had a system, and it fed to winters straight. Picking up where we left off. Let's step inside one winter week and watch the whole preservation machine hum. Picture a gray dawn, frost needling the thatch, a breath you can see. The pig has already gone to cuts. The fat rendered low and slow, till it shines like candlelight in a pot. Salt waits in a chest, like coins in a coffer. Vinegar crocks line a wall. Herbs hang upside down, brittle and fragrant, like green bells that forgot to chime. Day 1 is brine and patience. Slabs disappear into salt, as if the white crystals were snowdrifts, swallowing a road. Hands rub and fold, finding seams and pockets where moisture hides. Cloth wraps, cords, tie. Names get whispered: shoulder, belly, ham, because you labeled by memory when ink costs more than supper. In the corner, a boy grinds dried sage and juniper with the seriousness of a prayer. The room smells of cold, iron, and a sharp green note that wakes you faster than coffee ever could. Day 2 belongs to smoke. The fire doesn't roar, it purrs. Oak and apple take turns. Hickory when the light fades. Damp wood, never. Sap sings wrong, and bitterness clings. Someone adjusts a shutter. Someone else dusts soot from a beam. The meat hangs like sleeping travelers on a night road, quiet, patient, darkening by degrees. There's a rhythm to tending smoke you can't write down. The way you listen to a crackle. Watch a ribbon of blue. Feel heat with the back of your hand. You don't time it. You taste it on the air and call it done when the smoke says so. By the 3rd day, vinegar claims its share. Chunks slide into crocks with a steady glug as brine rises. Rosemary stalks snap. Cloves drop like small black stars. Peppercorns rattle. The brine bites your nose and waters your eyes. And still you lean closer. Because sour in winter is a promise of brightness later. Lids go on. Stones go atop the lids. The weight is literal and moral. You're pressing choices into place. Day 4 is fat. The kitchen warms without flame. Rendered lard does that, throws a soft light like a friendly ghost. Crocks wait with their mouths open as the hot liquid hushes everything it touches. The meat sinks below the gleam and vanishes, sealed away from time and ruin. When it cools, the surface goes from mirror to moon, opaque and calm. You'll break it like ice weeks from now and release a smell that reminds you of this room and these hands. The 5th day is for cold. Down into the ground you go, where the air doesn't change its mind every hour. Barrels settle into straw beds in the pit. Ice blocks gut square, as if winter itself had learned carpentry. Slide into sawdust coffins. A child's mitten goes missing. It will turn up in April, stuffed with hay and a secret. The lid goes on. Snow obliges by falling just then, because sometimes the world loves a neat ending. And then waiting, the hardest craft. You wait and you rotate. You soak and you taste. You pull a piece from salt, rinse it, let it rest. You peek into the smokehouse by lamplight, a head counting drowsing shapes. You crack the fat seal with the back of a spoon and feel that satisfying gift. You lift a crock lid and listen. Vinegar doesn't bubble, but the nose tells you it's working, and that's enough. Here's the part the books skip. Flavor is survival, too. The body needs calories. The spirit needs reasons. A meal that sings keeps quarrels short and shoulders square. So the browning matters. The way a salted slab sizzles in a pan, throws a scent that climbs the rafters and tugs the whole house toward the table. The way a smoked rind kisses cabbage and turns a pale pot into a feast. The way a vinegar cut, rinsed and simmered with leeks, lands with a bright, surprising warmth in January. You call it comfort. They called it Tuesday. There are rules no one writes but everyone knows. Never rush salt. Never let the smoke billow black. Never let a crock sit in a warm draft. Never trust a lid you haven't pressed. If the brine smells wrong, don't argue with it. If the fat seal looks cracked, don't talk yourself into courage. There's frugality, and then there's folly. Learn the line. When you waste, you learn. When you learn, you waste less. By spring, the ledger balances. Trade wraps around all this like twine around a parcel. Salt from the coast buys bread up. Smokehouse reputations travel faster than carts. A monk's pamphlet on herb pairings ends up as a rhyme on a milkmaid's lips. A good winter becomes a dowry. A bad one becomes a story you repeat until it's a warning. Even the offcuts have destinations. Trimmings feed a broth. Bones sweeten a stew. Rind seasons a pot of peas that would otherwise taste like mud and memory. And the seasons choreograph it. Autumn is sharp and busy. Slaughter, salt, stack, smoke. Winter is quiet and exacting. Tend, check, rotate, scrape, measure without measuring. Spring is generous. The last sealed meets meat first. Greens fat meets bitter. Smoke meets new leaf. Summer is watchful. Herbs to cut, shade to build, patience to bank for later. You live inside a loop that feeds you because you feed it. There's a tenderness in the toughness. A grandmother showing a granddaughter how to feel for hidden pockets where brine won't reach. A father teaching a son when smoke smells sweet versus sour. A neighbor handing over a bundle of time with a look that says, I remember the winter your roof went. You don't survive alone. You don't flavor alone. You don't learn alone. Preservation is a household skill but a village art. And if you zoom in really in, you see the physics and chemistry humming like bees in a hive. Salt shifting water across a membrane you can't see. Smoke laying down micro-thin coats of armor. Vinegar shifting pH like moving a fence line in a pasture. Fat denying oxygen a cetath table. Air carrying moisture away until flavor stands closer together like people huddled for warmth. You didn't name the processes. You named the results. Safe. Tasty. Hours. Mistakes. Write the margins. A storm steals your smoke drawer and leaves soot bitterness in the meat. Next time, you shore the windward wall. A soft winter melts the icehouse too soon. Next time, you cut thicker blocks and pack deeper in sawdust. A batch of herbs molds because you had tied bundles to fat. Next time, you spread them and move them into a breezeway. Failure is tuition. No one graduates. Everyone keeps learning. What's striking is how these methods refuse to be merely old. They're current the moment you try them. You salt a steak properly and understand it January 500 years ago. You hang a cut where air moves and tastes patience. You poach confit from a crock and nod at the audacity of calling this French when 1,000 unnamed hands did it namelessly under. You boil a pickled cut with leeks, taste the first bite, and think, all right, this is why sour was treasured. And when you carve into a dry-edged piece, you were brave enough to leave alone until its surface went dark and firm. You find a tenderness that feels like mercy. You trim the rind and drop it into soup, and it teaches the broth how to speak. You slice and the knife tells you what you already know. Time isn't an enemy when you give it a job. Call it part 2, part winter, part wisdom. The second act where the plan meets the weather, where the tools meet the tongue, where the old tricks keep proving they're not tricks, at all just agreements with the world. Salt will pull water if you let it. Smoke will protect if you keep it gentle. Cold will keep if you shelter it. Acid will guard if you balance it. Fat will lock if you pour it clean. Air will refine if you trust it. And you will eat when the fields sleep, not because you got lucky, but because you listened. So stock the chest, tend the ember, harvest the ice, tie the herbs, pour the seal, hang the prize, then wait, not idly, not nervously, not forever. Wait with a pot on, a spoon in hand, a plan for leftovers, a story for the table. Because the secret never lived in cellars or it lives in the hands that do these small, exacting, repeatable things. The meal is only the proof. The craft is the point, and the winter just keeps score. By midsummer, the rhythm returned full circle. The animals fattened, fields swayed with gold, and the peasants already thought of winter again, not with dread, but with strategy. Theirs was a life lived on repeat, but not on autopilot. Every year taught new lessons. A salt batch that drew too much moisture, a smokehouse draft that pulled too hard, a fat seal that cracked in the frost. They learned, adjusted, and passed the secrets down in whispers over steaming pots. Each technique was an inheritance more valuable than coin. A family could lose land, lose tools, but never afford to lose knowledge. The village moved like a single organism when preservation season came. One neighbor lent hands for salting. Another brought applewood for smoking. Smoke drifted above the rooftops like incense to some ancient household god of survival. Dogs barked. Children carried buckets. Women stirred brine with wooden paddles taller than themselves. The air smelled of vinegar, sweat, and life refusing to yield. It was messy and magnificent, the smell of civilization held together by salt and faith. You could tell how well a village worked together by how their cellars looked in January. The best ones had order. Barrels stacked by method, jars labeled by herb, each sealed pot lined in straw like an offering. Even the poorest huts had a corner that gleamed with rendered fat. A shelf of dried beans, a smoked ham swaying gently in the draft. Survival wasn't random, it was organized, intentional, beautiful in its austerity. And there was art in it too. The way smoke curled through a chink in the wall, the rhythm of water sloshing in a tub as someone rinsed salt from cured meat, the golden gleam of fat hardening at dusk, catching the last light through the thatch. Even the tools, the stone crocks, the iron hooks, the wooden paddles, polished smooth by generations, told stories. A good curing knife was passed down like a surname. Each nick in the blade was a chapter in a family history, written not with ink, but with survival. As summer deepened, so did gratitude. Each finished batch meant one less worry when snow returned. The fields outside glowed with wheat, but inside the barns and smokehouses, there was another kind of harvest, the invisible one, the harvest of time itself. Every salted slab, every sealed crock, every suspended ham was a promise waiting quietly to be kept. Even the monasteries borrowed from peasant wisdom. Behind cloister walls, monks scribbled careful records of what worked: temperature ranges, brine ratios, herb combinations. To them, food preservation wasn't just a trade, it was theology. They believed waste was a sin and patience a virtue. Their cellars became the blueprint for Europe's survival through centuries of cold and famine. And when the bells rang for vespers, they prayed not only for souls, but for the weather, the salt supply, and the slow, invisible mercy of time. It's easy to romanticize the past, to picture candlelight and rustic charm. But the truth was harder and more admirable. Every preserved meal represented hours of grueling labor, hands chapped raw from salt, backs aching from smoke and ice. Yet beneath the hardship was a quiet triumph. The mastery of elements. Fire to cure, water to brine, earth to bury, air to dry, and time, always time to finish the work. They didn't conquer nature, they collaborated with it. When autumn returned, the cycle began again, but with small refinements. A new herb blend here, a thicker layer of lard there. Someone discovered that packing meat with thyme before sealing gave it a cleaner scent. Another found that alder would lend a gentler smoke. These weren't accidents, they were evolution, slow and human. Innovation born from hunger, tested by winters, confirmed by taste. The older generation taught the younger through repetition. Listen, they'd say, you'll hear when the salt stops talking. Feel the brine, it should sting, not burn. Watch the smoke, it should move like breath, not wind. These weren't instructions, they were poetry disguised as practicality, and those lessons outlived the hands that gave them. 100 years later, a child would repeat them without knowing the names of the teachers. But knowing their truth, as centuries passed, much of that knowledge faded, replaced by convenience, by machines and markets. We forgot the language of patience, the sound of salt curing quietly in the dark. But step into an old stone cellar, still lined with hooks and barrels, and you can feel an echo of that old discipline humming under the dust. The air itself remembers. It smells faintly of smoke, vinegar, and purpose. And if you look closely enough, you'll see the pattern never truly broke. Every refrigerator hums because of them. Every jar of pickles, every smoked sausage, every slow-aged cheese is their legacy made modern. We call it culinary craft now, or artisanal preservation. But it's the same story told in better lighting. The peasants were the first chefs of endurance, the first to turn necessity into artistry, survival into science. What they left behind wasn't just a method, it was a mindset, a way of living that said, nothing is wasted, everything has value, and time can be an ally if you treat it with respect. They turned scarcity into stability, hunger into harmony. Their tables might have been humble, but they carried the weight of genius born from cold mornings, smoky air, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow was worth preparing for. So when you slice into a piece of dry-aged meat, or open a jar that's been sealed for months, remember the hands that started it all, the nameless ones who salted, smoked, sealed, and waited. the ones who trusted the process long before anyone could explain it. They didn't just preserve food, they preserved the human instinct to adapt, to endure, to create meaning out of survival. And in that quiet endurance, they wrote the oldest recipe of all: how to outlast the winter, one small, perfect act at a time. By the time harvest fires burned low on the hills and the first frost licked the furrows, the work was already repeating itself, just as it always had, and as it always would. The rhythm of medieval life wasn't a line, it was a circle. They lived by cycles: the sowing, the growing, the reaping, the saving. And the saving was where their genius truly showed. Every salted slab, every smoked ham, every sealed crock was a message to the future. We made it this far. You will too. The new pigs were slaughtered just after the feast of St. Martin, when the air grew cool enough to trust again. That chill was a signal, as sure as any calendar the cue, to begin preserving. Villages smelled of wood smoke and brine. Men hauled barrels. Women boiled lard. Children picked herbs from the drying racks. It wasn't glamorous, but there was ceremony in it. A rhythm older than kings. Everyone knew their part. Everyone's survival depended on everyone else. The church bells rang through the valley as smoke rose in pale ribbons. Behind each cottage, small fires burned slow and steady, fed by oak, apple, and ash. The thick scent of curing meat mingled with peat and frost. Inside, mothers crushed salt with rolling pins and poured it like snow over red cuts of meat, rubbing until the grain dissolved and the flesh changed color under their hands. The salt burned their fingers, but they didn't flinch. That sting was security. They didn't have clocks, but they didn't need them. The smokehouse had its own heartbeat. You could feel it in the way the air pulsed, hear it in the way the embers whispered. Someone's job was to watch the door and the vents, adjusting the flow of air the way a musician adjusts pitch. Too little smoke and the meat soured. Too much and it turned bitter. Balance was everything. The villagers might not have known the words temperature control or air circulation, but they practiced them like second nature. It wasn't science, it was instinct made sacred. And when the smoking was done, when the last log had burned to ash, they hung the hams high in the rafters, out of reach of rats and damp. They glistened like bronze shields in the flickering light. Below them, crocks of vinegar pickles lined the shelves, pork in one, venison in another, floating in liquid that shimmered amber under the lamplight. The brine bubbled faintly when the room warmed, releasing the sharp tang of vinegar and cloves that caught in your throat and made you hungry at once. Each crock was a small fortress of flavor, guarded by acidity, salt, and patience. Winter came hard that year, but the village didn't starve. When the wind howled, they lit the hearth and chipped off chunks of preserved meat. Some were boiled to soften the salt, others sliced thin and fried crisp in their own fat. The flavor was deep and primal, the taste of wood smoke, earth, and endurance. Children learned early what each smell meant. The bright sour of pickled meat meant celebration. The nutty perfume of rendered lard meant plenty. Those scents became their calendar, marking time more reliably than parchment ever could. Even the poorest households found a way to save something. A strip of bacon, a handful of beans, a few dried apples, strung on a line above the fire. They didn't see these as luxuries. They were proof of foresight, badges of competence. The act of preserving was the act of hope itself. Every sealed jar, every salted cut said, "We expect to see spring again." In the monasteries, the work continued. Monks in brown robes bent over vats of vinegar and tubs of grain, humming hymns that blurred with the bubbling of the brine. Their cellars were cathedrals of preservation, rows upon rows of stone jars labeled in Latin, filled with herbs, roots, salted fish, and smoked cheese. The air was damp, cool, alive with the scent of garlic and thyme. When famine struck outside the walls, those stores fed not just the brothers, but entire villages. The monks wrote recipes like scripture, preserving not only food but the wisdom behind it. And far from the abbeys, in the frozen valleys and thatched hamlets, the same rituals unfolded in miniature. Families gathered to share smokehouses, brine pits, and stories. They argued over wood choices, teased about whose lard sealed better, and sang while they worked. A kind of fellowship born from necessity. Hunger taught unity better than any sermon. When the snow melted, the cellars thinned but never emptied. A single cured ham could stretch until the next slaughter. Fat caps melted into soups and stews, feeding entire households with flavor that tasted of last year's labor. Nothing wasted, nothing left to chance. Even the last rind of smoked meat, scraped and boiled, turned broth into a meal that could feed 6. And when at last spring returned, the people didn't rest. They looked to their fields, their livestock, their seeds, because they understood what most of us have forgotten, that survival is not a miracle. It's a method. You prepare before you're desperate. You work when you're weary. You save when you're safe. That's how you beat the winter, and the next one, and the next dot. So the rhythm began again. The salting stones scrubbed clean. The herbs planted in neat rows along the cottage walls. The smokehouses repaired. The crocks patched. The cellar doors reinforced. Each small act, mundane, repetitive, backbreaking, was also magnificent. It meant defiance. It meant continuity. It meant life. If you stood there on the edge of that village, the air sharp with brine and wood smoke, you'd see something worth remembering. Not poverty, not backwardness, but mastery, the quiet, unglamorous mastery of people who understood the seasons better than any scholar. They weren't just feeding themselves. They were preserving the human rhythm of survival. One handful of salt, one curl of smoke, one sealed jar at a time. And maybe that's the real lesson. Every age has its winters. Every generation faces hunger of one kind or another. But those who endure are always the ones who learn to prepare, to salt what they can, to seal what they must, to share what they have. The medieval peasants didn't just preserve food. They preserved the art of perseverance itself. The taste of endurance. The flavor of hope that lasts.